Title slide, Remote the Connected Faculty Summit hosted by ASU Housekeeping. Let's get started. Tabs on the left side, Captions. Captions will display during the live broadcast. Choose English or Spanish.
Hello, and welcome to Remote, the Connected Faculty Summit. I'm Patty O'Sullivan, Content Manager with Every Learner Everywhere, and I'll be moderating today's sessions. These sessions in this 90-minute block are sponsored by Every Learner Everywhere, a nonprofit network that advocates for and supports institutions in achieving equitable outcomes in U.S. higher education through advances in digital learning. This block of the Every Learner Ask the Expert sessions focuses on equitable and inclusive teaching. And now we begin session 1. What exactly does it mean to teach in ways that are inclusive? Teaching specialists from Achieving the Dream share strategies and tips from their upcoming strategy guide collection featuring culturally responsive teaching, anti-racist teaching, abolitionist teaching, and open pedagogy. Our presenters are H. Ray Keith and Sarah Kinnison. H. Ray Keith is an educational consultant for Achieving the Dream and founder of E&A Consulting. He brings 25 years of professional experience in higher education, K-12, and nonprofit community-based organizations. He formerly served as the Associate Dean of Instructional Intervention and Support at the Community College of Aurora, and he led the development of the college's Center for Teaching and Learning. H. Ray Keith holds a master's degree in higher education from the University of Denver and a bachelor's degree from Oklahoma City University. Sarah Kinnison is a program development consultant on the teaching and learning team at Achieving the Dream, a role in which she supports Every Learner Everywhere's digital learning equity initiatives. Her degrees from the University of Chicago and University of Illinois Chicago, her teaching experience, and her expertise in philosophy of education and pedagogical practices guide her work in developing teaching and learning initiatives to transform practice in the field. Sarah has served as a researcher, writer, PhD facilitator, and curriculum consultant for various educational and social justice organizations working to break down systemic barriers and expand the reach of educational excellence. She views equity as the most critical aspect of education that benefits learners of all backgrounds and society as a whole. Participants, our presenters have asked that you please put your role and institution in the chat. I see a lot of people are already commenting where they're from and what the temperature is. If you are a faculty associated with an institution, please add that as well. If you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A. The floor is yours, Ray and Sarah.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you all for joining us today. We want to start our session with our session intentions, and these intentions will allow participants to explore inclusive instructional strategies and enhance their knowledge of culturally responsive, open, anti-racist, and abolitionist teaching and learning. Throughout our session, we will focus on instructional practices that center and affirm the cultures, identities, and lived experiences of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian Pacific Islander students.
Text, opening inquiry. How can you value your students' culture? A blue question mark.
So we want to start our session today thinking about this inquiry here. And so as we engage in today's session, we would like you to keep this opening question in mind, and we ask that you consider how you can affirm, validate, and value your students' culture, lived experiences, perspectives, and identities while creating educational experiences and spaces that are liberating through the implementation of inclusive teaching and learning.
Text, common understanding of language, inclusion, culturally relevant pedagogy.
So it's really important as we engage in this work. One critical aspect of that is having a common understanding of language and terminology that guides us as we authentically take part in the important work of inclusive, open, culturally responsive, and anti-racist teaching and learning. And so on the next couple of slides, we will share definitions of foundational terminology that you will utilize to advance this work. Please take a few moments to review the terms as we provide an overview and the importance of having a common understanding within your institution, within your departments, within your disciplines is that many times as we engage in this work, we might be using this terminology and this language in ways that are not authentic to the way these concepts were created. And so we're going to start with inclusion. And so when we think about inclusion, it goes beyond surface level practice of celebrating differences and diversity. It requires active and intentional integration of cultures, identities, and perspectives of students that have historically been othered in education. Inclusion requires creating opportunities for students to connect to their education in ways that are meaningful and embrace their racialized and cultural identities. It's not only acknowledging them in the space, but them having a voice in that space that is validated, affirmed, and valued. Culturally responsive or culturally relevant pedagogy was coined. This phrase was coined by Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, and this scholar posits that culturally responsive teaching empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural references to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes in ways that advance their learning. Culturally responsive teaching recognizes that all students learn differently and takes instructional approaches that connect students' language, family structure, background, and cultural identities to their learning. It aims to improve the academic success of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander students while affirming their lived experiences and identities. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, who will share a couple of more terms that we will be using in today's session.
Text, inclusive instruction, anti-racist pedagogy.
Okay, to continue, thank you, Ray. To continue with the common understandings of language,
The speaker gestures.
Inclusive instruction intentionally addresses the needs of students from diverse cultures, backgrounds, abilities, and from historically marginalized or minoritized identities. And inclusive instructional practices take a multitude of approaches to engage all learners in the classroom, while also taking into consideration how traditional practices exclude some students from the learning experience. Anti-racist pedagogy goes beyond making course content and curriculum racially diverse. It begins with a commitment to critical self-reflection and understanding of one's own identity and positionality in relationship to students' identities, lifelong learning, and recognizing racist ideas and policies within education. And it requires a willingness to act and cultivate anti-racist pedagogical practices. To continue with common understanding of language, abolitionist teaching and learning. Scholar Bettina Love, if you haven't heard of her, we really recommend listening to her and reading her work. She defines abolitionist teaching as a framework that focuses on restoring humanity for students in educational spaces. Abolitionist teaching is the practice of pursuing educational freedom for all students with the intention of transformation rather than mere reform, reframing, or reimagining current educational systems. Transformation versus reform, reframe, reimagine. It's also about Black joy and always putting love at the center of what we're doing, creating spaces where students are not only surviving, but thriving. And to push her book, which I think is wonderful, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom by Bettina Love. Next, for open pedagogy, students are invited to construct knowledge rather than merely consuming knowledge from other sources. Students, along with faculty, utilize existing expertise while also seeking to include voices that are typically excluded from the curriculum. And student and faculty even have an opportunity to advance the field with student-designed and published or adapted culturally responsive materials that are openly shared with others. Open educational resources are a central tool for engaging in this pedagogy.
Text, tenets of inclusive teaching and learning approaches. Achieving the dream.
Thank you. This is the tenets of inclusive teaching and learning. In this table are the tenets. The tenets that advance inclusive, culturally responsive, anti-racist, and abolitionist teaching and learning. One, understanding the importance of embedding asset and strength-based ideologies that affirm and validate the cultural identities and lived experiences of diverse students. Two, implementing practices that elevate and uphold the values, community, cultural wealth, and funds of knowledge of Black, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander and Indigenous students in all aspects of a course to disrupt and counter dominant norms, standards, and ideologies. Tenet 3, developing an awareness and conscientiousness to center social justice and dismantle practices that have historically led to inequities. Tenet 4, taking a holistic approach to caring for students in ways that are meaningful for them and their cultural identities. And Tenet 5, leveraging students' cultures to advance their engagement and educational experiences.
Slide title, Student-Centered Instruction. The woman touches her chest with her hands.
Student-centered instruction. Here we identify the aspect of student-centered instruction as it relates to inclusivity. When you think about inclusive instruction, by definition, it includes or centers the student with a focus on the student's identity, culture, learning style, and interests. Rather than teaching the subject exclusively, you teach the subject as it relates to the learner. This keeps the content relevant, meaningful, and memorable. For example, a comprehensive history lesson about World War II that includes perspectives from members of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Japanese citizens, both those who were in internment camps as well as those fighting in the US Army, will be crucial learning experiences for all students and will be an intentional way to engage students from African American and Japanese backgrounds whose history is typically left out of our lessons. So being mindful, however, that we're not tokenizing or bringing folks into instruction in ways that may be harmful or deficit-based as it relates to their cultures. Student-centered instruction empowers students by affirming their culture throughout all aspects of the course, such as curriculum design, course material, instructional practices, demonstrating their learning through self-selected assessments.
Text, whose voices are heard or not heard in the classroom. Student voice, it's time to listen.
Sorry, I skipped one. Here on the slide are some strategies. Think about what the outcomes are when we put these inclusive strategies into practice. Did you notice times when your instruction empowered students? This could have resulted from allowing them to choose topics that were interesting and meaningful to them, and they were active and engaged in their learning. Did you notice a time when you gave students a choice regarding how to present their learning and knowledge? Their knowledge was assessed in a way that made them feel confident, and motivated. We all benefit from using our voices to express our authentic experiences and ideas. Did you see how bringing in student choice and their voice led to significant positive learning experiences? Have you noticed the positive learning that happens when students from typically marginalized backgrounds, such as your African American students, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American Pacific Islander students, are provided with culturally affirming materials and assignments that are like mirrors for their own lived experiences? Have you noticed the positive learning? When you brought in literature that included Filipino and Indigenous authors, offered independent and group work that made students feel comfortable, either way they chose to work, matching their cultural norms. When you exposed students to important African American leaders in physics and chemistry, did you notice more inclusion and connection from everyone? It makes such a difference to successful experiences and course completion and graduation rates. Through these instructional approaches, we become reflexive practitioners and we move beyond the reflective approach to teaching and learning.
Two speakers, a woman and a man, appear in separate video feeds, continuing their presentation.
And so, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ray. Are you still connected?
Yes, can you hear me, Sarah?
Yes. Doing good now. Oh.
I had some internet issues, so apologies. And so thank you, Sarah. And what we want to talk about in this next part of the session is the importance of student voice and whose voice is being heard and whose voice is not being heard in the classroom. And so as we engage in inclusive teaching and learning, it's essential to center and elevate student voice. When centering students and their voice, you create an educational experience where students feel validated and affirmed. They feel that their voice matters and that they are fully engaging in the learning experience. It's also important to be mindful about different ways that students learn and be intentional about developing instructional approaches that meet their needs. In creating inclusive learning experiences, the diverse cultures and backgrounds of students must be considered and validated, um, and also really recognizing, creating a space where they can share how they are defining their engagement, how they're defining how they're learning, and what participation looks like them, as they take ownership of their own learning. As we listen to our students, we can increase our knowledge about teaching strategies and techniques that support them as confident learners. Many of my colleagues have shared that when they have been intentional about asking students about how they learn best, students have shared how small groups have helped them to feel more confident and comfortable and demonstrating their knowledge, their learning, and understanding of course concepts. And another example of this is a student shared with my colleague that although they might not be verbally contributing, to the course discussion, taking notes is an active way that they find that advances their learning in a way that they can then be able to contribute, to the larger groups, when they've processed, and been allowed to have time to process that information in ways that are meaning to them, based off of their cultural identities. And so, as we think about student voice, we really want to make sure that we're engaging students in ways that, are meaningful to them. And so on this slide here, what you'll see, again, we need to think about how are we incorporating those student voices as it relates to our inclusive teaching practices. What should we be mindful of? We should be mindful of who our students are and how they're experiencing the world based off of their intersecting identities. And so what you see here are student responses from a national study where students were asked specific questions about their learning experiences as it relates to their cultures and current events that were happening at that time, which was, during the racial and, health pandemic. And so students were able to provide authentic responses, through this platform, and their voices were able to be heard and validated. And so I'd like to share one of these quotes with you. The current social climate has created such an environment that talking about race is pivotal to our forward moving as a collective society. And so, again, creating this space where students can truly, share their experiences, how they're engaging with the content, how the content is impacting them, and what's going on in the world that might be impacting their ability to, grow and learn in those educational spaces. So take a moment to think about how you might create opportunities for students to have a voice in the classroom. What practices, and what support can you, put into place, that creates an inclusive space for them to share authentically? And when students have these types of opportunities to share their insights and perspectives, they're able to genuinely show up as their whole selves, as their full selves, and their authentic selves. We really need their voices in order to influence our teaching practices. And then I'm going to share one more quote, with you
The
all.
slide shows student quotes.
We can create change now that will allow future generations to experience a more equitable society. And so, thinking about how you could use this particular, response from students to impact or inform, your teaching and learning practices and creating inclusive spaces. So, again, thinking about this as a strategy or a tool to again begin to engage students in a way that's meaningful to them, but also create a space where they can, truly share their experiences and their voices in a way that they feel valued and affirmed. Another way that, we can think about engaging student voice and really helping students inform our teaching practices is to conduct surveys. And so we're talking about these informal surveys that happen throughout the semester. So you could have a survey at the beginning of the semester to get to know your students, thinking about asking questions about how they learn best, what type of learning environments do they excel in, and then doing those surveys throughout the semester, in the middle of the semester, end of the semester, to gather student feedback on how they're experiencing instruction in the classroom. And these surveys can be informal, they can be exit slips, 1 minute papers, they could be polls, as we're using all of the digital technology. We could be doing polls and Zooms. We could be using Kahoot, those type of digital tools that are in the moment way to get feedbacks. And so when we increase student voice, student engagement, and student ownership of their education, there's a strong potential to improve student outcomes. My faculty colleagues have found that student responses from surveys have helped them improve curriculum, shift their instructional practices, and create relationships and partnerships with students, which has led to more inclusive learning experiences with their students, and also in many ways begin to close equity gaps for students. Efforts to incorporate student voice are stronger when we include the following elements: intentional efforts to incorporate multiple and diverse student voices. So, making sure that we're asking questions where we're getting feedback, and certainly making sure that students are able to share their own perspectives based off of their cultures, their identities, their lived experiences. And then, especially thinking about those students who have been historically marginalized through the educational system, and then building trust between students and educators while recognizing and affirming the voices of those who have been silenced by traditional teaching methods. We also think it's important to consider and include students, the voice of students with disabilities and students who are multilingual learners, as well as adult learners who are in your classroom spaces. And so Sarah will now discuss our final strategy related to inclusive instructional practices.
The slide changes to a diagram representing student feedback.
So another form of student feedback, or student feedback is another important way to include students into the course, to continue with student surveys, as are also a type of student feedback. A sociology professor from a community college in Colorado shared this strategy called Start, Stop, and Continue activity that she used with her students to get feedback. So, any way the student can provide feedback to the instructor is helpful to bring in that ability for students to be responding well to the instructor and to enhance instruction and learning. So it's a stop, start, continue is a strategy where you ask the students on a note card or in a chat, you literally just ask them, what do you want me to start, stop, and continue? What do they feel is culturally relevant and responsive? What's going well? What is having positive impact, making them feel validated and affirmed? And what do they want to stop within reason? You're still going to be reading and writing in your course, but what can we stop and why do we want to stop it? So students actually may surprise you. This faculty member that I'm referring to, she really thought that her discussion posts were a helpful aspect of the course, but the students really felt like they were actually a hindrance and getting in the way of their progress. So once she took those out and brought in other elements that the students wanted to continue, she found that helped. That helped a lot.
Slide text. Consider one meaningful strategy you'll take to transform teaching and learning.
Okay, Ray?
And Sarah, I'm going to continue. Let's stay on start, stop, and continue.
Sure.
And so when we think about getting student feedback, many times we have our own instructional practices that we've implemented, that we've used over the years. And we might be getting great results from that. But as we know, each classroom and each course has its own personality, and students are very, very different in those particular sessions. And so when we think about what can we continue, asking students again what's working for them, and really centering the student in this feedback loop. And so many times you'll hear students say they want to continue things that are meaningful to them, based off of their own identities, based off of their own lived experiences. Um, Also, continuing practices that allow them to engage authentically with the course materials. And so, also thinking about what do we want to start. And so, this is a great way to get students to share out how their learning styles or how they best learn in educational spaces. And so, as Sarah says, thinking about stopping, what are those things that we want to stop? And also thinking about it, as many times when I've shared this with folks, I always say, think about this within reason, and also be mindful that we have a strength based approach when we share this with our students. Many folks might think, our students are going to say, I don't want to have any more homework. I don't want to do a lot of readings. And so, again, within reason, but you'll be really, as Sarah said, surprised that the feedback that you're going to get is truly impactful for becoming inclusive instructors and creating inclusive teaching and learning practices. And so, as Sarah had said, my colleague shared these discussion posts. Again, students, again, if we don't have that feedback, we don't know. And so, students were not authentically engaging in that particular teaching and learning strategy. And so, if that had happened throughout the rest of the semester, and this was during the pandemic, just imagine the experience students would have had if they had to continue to do those discussion posts throughout the semester. And so, as we think about this approach to inclusive teaching and learning, it really is important that we center our students and give them space that they can co-construct the learning experience in the classroom with us as educators.
Ray, thank you for
Yes,
that elaboration. Thank you so much.
yes, no problem. And so, as we end this session, we've shared a lot of concepts, strategies, and instructional practices regarding inclusive, culturally relevant, anti racist, abolitionist, and open teaching and learning practices. We've taken a dive into the critical importance of inclusive instructional pedagogies that center, affirm, and validate student culture, identity, and voice to advance their learning experiences in ways that connect the course material and content to their lives. And that really thinking about those students that have historically been excluded through traditional teaching and practices and approaches. How do we begin to make that shift so that we are creating inclusive environments where all of our students have an opportunity to engage and learn in ways that are impactful to their educational experience? And so, as you leave this session, we ask that you consider how student feedback can inform your engagement as it relates to inclusive teaching and learning, and help you begin to transition and transform your instructional practices to be more inclusive and more meaningful to those students that are in the spaces and in the institutions that you serve. And so, our question here is, consider one meaningful strategy you'll take with you to transform your teaching and learning and the student experience. And thinking about, again, is that incorporating student voice? Is that changing your course content to be more culturally relevant, to be more inclusive? And then, how do we center students in this educational experience? And so, thank you. And we're going to turn it over to Patty, who's going to transition to us to our next topic.
Text questions. A Q&A image.
Thank you, Ray and Sarah, for an informative and resource-filled session. And thank you to our participants for joining us. We're going to hold off on the Q&A for this session and combine it, with the Q&A of the next session and an extended Ask the Expert panel. In the meantime, we're going to post some resources for you on the topic of inclusive teaching. So I'm going to put those right there in the chat. All right, so let's move on to our second session.